In this lesson, we'll take a look at how to begin sculpting in ZBrush. So open up ZBrush and let's bring in some base geometry. I'm just going to start with a simple sphere to show this. And so we can start with a sphere. We'll draw it onto our canvas. We'll go to Edit Mode. Let's convert it to a polymesh before we start sculpting. And let's begin to subdivide it. So I'll hit Control D a few times just to add plenty of polygons in here. And then we can begin sculpting. So the first thing that we want to do is select a sculpting brush. Those brushes are going to be found over here on the shelf on the left in the upper portion. When I click on this, you can see there's a whole range of different brushes that you can select. Okay, you can also bring up that pop-up by hitting B on your keyboard, and then you can narrow down the brushes based on the letter of the first part of their name, the first letter. So if I want a brush that starts with C, I could now hit C. That'll narrow it down, and then you can see the orange letter associated with each particular brush. So really each brush can be accessed via a 3-key combination. So B to bring up the brushes, the first letter of the name, and then if I want to get move or morph, I can hit O, and there I've got that particular brush. Now in this lesson we're going to stick with some of the real basic brushes. So we'll stick with the standard brush. So I'll hit S, and then standard is the next letter for that is T, so we'll hit T, and now we've got the standard brush. Okay, now you can see as I hover over the model, I get this sort of red icon that flows along the surface. There's an inner ring and an outer ring. Now we can change our draw size and our focal shift, which correspond with the two rings. So if I change my draw size, you can see both rings sort of enlarge, and then if I change the focal shift, the distance between the two rings gets smaller or larger. Okay, that's sort of a fall off or a softness between where it's at full strength versus where there's no strength at all. So I can manipulate those. The S key on your keyboard will allow you to manipulate the draw size wherever you happen to be. Same thing with O for focal shift. Now to define if we're actually going to be pulling out detail or pushing it into the surface, that's where Z add and Z sub come in. So right now I've got Z add selected, and the Z intensity will decide how strong it actually is. So if I drag across the surface, Z add is telling it that we want to use the draw size with this focal shift to pull out detail from the surface. So in this case I'm able to pull this out. If I hit Z sub and do the same thing, it actually is going to push it into the surface. Okay. Now anytime we're sculpting, anytime we're doing that, you can go in and choose different modifier keys. So Shift, Control, and Alt will enable you to do different things as you sculpt. So for instance, I have Z add selected. If I now hit hit Alt, you can see a little minus sign appear, and that's telling me that I'm just doing the inverse. So in this case, I'm subtracting. But when I let off, I'm back to adding. Okay, so that's a nice way to go back and forth between Z add and Z sub. The same thing applies if I'm in Z sub and I hold down Alt, it's going to actually add. So it's just going to do the inverse of whatever you have selected. Now if I take the Z intensity way down and do this, you can see that it takes a lot more stroke back and forth to build up that detail, versus if I increase the Z intensity, one stroke is going to create a very harsh detail. So you can change your Z intensity to get different effects. Now another modifier key is Shift. So Shift will allow me to smooth out detail that I've created. So I can hit Shift and that'll sort of smooth everything out. You can see because I'm working on a very high resolution, it's keeping the overall large shapes but kind of smoothing out some of the smaller bits of it there. If I take my draw size way down, start to draw this out, change my draw size back up, I can sort of smooth it back into the surface in here, and that's just holding down Shift as I'm sculpting. And again, this is nice because you can go back and forth with sculpting, smoothing out, you know, holding Alt to push back in, smoothing that back out. And so you can really go back and forth quite easily. Now one thing to also think about is if we want to sort of move some of this geometry around. So this is the standard brush is allowing us to sculpt across the surface just by drawing strokes. And I'm just using a Wacom tablet to do this. So a tablet and a grip pen is going to be really useful as you work here in ZBrush. You can utilize the pressure sensitivity of it. But let's say that I want to kind of push and pull things. So I want to grab the Move brush. So I'll just do Move. And this is going to work in a slightly different way. So rather than dragging across the surface, I'm going to click and pull bits of the surface out. Okay, and I can push them in as well. This will enable you to kind of reshape and reform objects in a slightly different way. But it's a very common brush. You're going to be using it a lot. I can still go back, and you can see when I hit Shift, it actually chooses the smooth brush, which you can see there. And you can change the smooth brush that's associated with that by selecting a different smooth brush. But I can go back in and smooth things out. You can always go back to lower levels if you're not getting the effect that you want. It's not smoothing out as much as you want. You can go to a lower level and then smooth it out there, and that'll get rid of any of those large dents. Come back to a lower level even still, and you can see I can really start to smooth things out. Go back up to the higher level, kind of smooth things out there. Okay, so move is also going to be a very common brush. Now, you can also work symmetrically if you want to, and symmetry is going to be found under Transform, Activate Symmetry, and then you can choose the axis across which you want to create the symmetry. So you've got X, Y, and Z, mirror symmetry, which will keep on. You've also got radial symmetry that you can create. So you can see here, if I've got symmetry on in the X direction, you can see I actually get an indication of where that cursor is on the other side. So I can come in and let me go back and get the standard brush. I can come in and start to do some sculpting over here, and you can see that's mirroring that over to the other side. Okay, it's allowing me to work symmetrically. Now that's across the X-axis. We can also turn on radial symmetry, and you can see that that'll create symmetry going around in a circle, and you can choose the different number of count, how many instances you want to be able to do that around the surface, and choose your different axes as well. Okay, so there's a lot of brushes in here, and we'll talk about several of these as we go through this process. Standard brush is going to be your basic brush, and then move is going to be a really commonly used brush to kind of move geometry around. Make sure that when you're done, turn off symmetry. You can go back and choose your move brush. Remember that those keys are there. You can also modify your draw size. Also, if you right click, you'll be able to change your draw size as well, and also your focal shift. The focal shift, I guess I should mention, the focal shift, if you take it down all the way, you're going to get a very sharp line there. Okay, so if I take that down, you're going to get a very sharp line, versus if I increase it all the way, it's going to be, you're going to have a very small line, a very large fall off. Okay, and we'll also talk about strokes. The strokes that we're using are dots or freehand. Will give you kind of the same effect, but you can also start to use color spray, which will kind of randomly place your sculpting there. You can also use drag rectangle, which utilizes alphas, and you can apply those to your model. And we'll talk more about this later, but the brush along with the alpha and the stroke will enable you to add different kinds of detail. Again, pulling out if you've got Z add selected, pushing in if you've got Z sub selected, and then your modifier keys, you can hold down Shift to smooth out any detail that you've created, or you can hold down Alt to do the inverse of whatever it is that you happen to have selected. Okay, and you want to just make sure if you're getting a very, very chunky look, you might check your subdivision levels and just make sure that you've got your model subdivided to an appropriate level to get the detail that you're trying to create. And if not, you can go ahead and subdivide that again. So that's kind of a basic look at sculpting and adding detail. We'll get more into a project-based approach as we go through this process. But the next thing that I want to talk about is poly painting. So it's our method in ZBrush of texturing and painting our models, which is going to be slightly different. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that in the next lesson.